Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to introduce the author today, a friend from my college days, Tom Mutch. Tom is a New Zealand journalist who has been on the front lines of one of the most defining conflicts of our time. He has been covering Ukraine since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion as a correspondent for the New Zealand Herald. His reporting has also appeared in publications like the Daily Beast, Popular Mechanics, Military Times, and the Byline Times, and he's a regular voice on the Daily Telegraph's podcast, Ukraine the Latest. Tom's work has been cited internationally and even recognized by both sides of the conflict. He is banned from Russia for reporting on human rights abuses, a feat that he's extremely proud of. Before he became a war correspondent, Tom read modern history at Christ Church College, Oxford, and is now a scholar at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. Tom's reporting captures not just the brutality of the war, but the resilience of those living through it. And his new book continues that work with extraordinary insight and empathy. Please join me in welcoming Tom Mutch. I'm going to start off by asking you what prompted this shift in your career, because I know after graduation you were working at the UK Parliament. You were also working on a book with Lord Ashcroft. And I want to ask, what was it that led to you becoming a war correspondent? Was that something intentional, or was that something that just came your way?
Of course. So first, once again, thank you all for coming, and thank you to the Indus Conclave for inviting me, not just to present my book, but also to have the fascinating conflict reporting panel that we had yesterday. Thank you very much, Mehrunissa, for a very kind introduction. And I have to say, it's not just a great honor to be here, but it's an honor to be sat next to you, having known you for about 10 years now. There's no one I would have rather liked to help me talk about my book and present it. It's been a very long journey for the both of us to get where we are, and we're both very happy to be sitting here. So as she mentioned earlier, I was actually a researcher in the British Parliament, and I was researching defence and security policy. Now, the United Kingdom had just come off the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The military had had a lot of cuts. There was a lot of terrible feeling about, well, what is the purpose of an armed forces in the 21st century, especially one that seems to be losing a lot of wars. And as part of that, we explored the potential conflicts that could face the world in the 21st century. And one of the major ones was Ukraine. Now, at this point in 2018, there was a very low-level conflict going on in the Donbass region in the east. It was out of the headlines. It's nothing like it was today. And I took a reporting trip out there with my parliamentary team and my colleagues. And it was a fascinating experience because for once we actually I got to not just hear about war from politicians or other journalists or military analysts in SW1 in central London, but I got to talk to real people, real soldiers who were risking their lives, real civilians who'd had their homes destroyed and were suffering. And I decided actually this is a much more valuable way to spend my time. And so as soon as that job ended, I decided to become a journalist specializing in conflict reporting, and my career started with the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan in Nagorno-Karabakh, where I lived for a couple of months. I also covered conflict in Afghanistan and in Lebanon, but in January 2022 I landed in Ukraine for the first time, and I remember very, very vividly waking up on the 24th of February 2022. You could hear the faint ring of explosions out in the background. The streets, now Kiev is this kind of very vibrant, modern, developed city of about 5 million people. The streets just being absolutely deserted of anyone except for soldiers. My phone kind of waking up and checking my phone and just having hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of messages. I think probably if there's anyone who was here for the short war with between India and Pakistan can remember what it was like waking up on a morning and realizing that the world had been turned upside down. Now, I think fairly fortunately that lasted, 6 days, was it? 5 days? But for Ukraine, this war has been going on now for nearly 4 years. Well, the smaller conflict in the east has now been going on for 11 years. The full-scale invasion, which has touched every region and every person in Ukraine, has now been going on for 4 years. And it's been the honor of my life, honestly, to be able to tell the stories of the people who've been affected by the conflict.
And my next question sort of stems from what you were just saying. Was there a defining moment or a particular moment that you think changed the way that you were viewing this war?
So there are a couple of places that I can sort of pick a moment. I think of the kind of defining moments for me in the war. I'll pick one very, very early on, which is when, because the scariest moment for everyone, people keep asking, when you're reporting war, well, are you scared? And the answer is sometimes. But that second day in particular, I remember we went down into a bunker, we went down into a basement in a metro station. Now, these metro stations are massive. You go down an escalator for about 70 meters and you're underground. And I remember there were a few scared guards there with assault rifles, and there was this huge big steel door that they sort of slammed shut. This was designed to survive a nuclear explosion. And I just remember us kind of being there and feeling like, oh my God, we could be going up the next day and there's just Russian tanks and Russian troops just in the streets of Kiev, and no one would have any idea what to do. We have no idea whether they would just line us up against a wall and shoot us. But that was also one of the times where I saw everybody in Ukraine start to come together. So many, I said the streets were deserted. One of the places the streets were not deserted were outside the recruiting offices for the Ukrainian army, where lines of young men and women stretched down the street for blocks and blocks to join up. There was also so many people who got involved with sort of humanitarian aid deliveries, so many people who got involved with helping transport people who were fleeing the country out to the west of Ukraine. And also it was the moment that I remember President Zelensky, when he went on his phone to talk to Ukrainians, to live stream the fact that him and his government was staying in the capital and they were determined to defend their sovereignty above all else. And that was a moment when I realized, oh, this is not just going to be the easy 3 days to Kiev walkover that everybody expected. The Ukrainians are going to put up a real fight here. Now I want to take you about a year later, because I want to talk about an experience that I remember that I had during the war that really shaped how I saw the conflict. Actually, no, let's jump about four months later. About 4 months later, I'm in the Donbas region in eastern Ukraine. And I remember I am there and I am introduced to a bunch of soldiers who we are working with. And they start telling me, we're in their trenches, close to the front lines, and they start telling me their life stories. And their life stories are absolutely fascinating. I remember there is one guy who is like the head of one of Ukraine's top universities. He was like the vice chancellor. He picked up there was 2 other people. One they were both high-powered corporate lawyers. They'd met literally on the Maidan Revolutionary Square about 10 years ago. They joined the army on the first day. There was another guy who was in President Zelensky's personal protection unit, his sort of secret service. And these were absolutely brilliant, talented, extraordinary people. But then I realized something else as well. I was like, these are Ukraine's most brilliant young people, and they are also the ones who are getting chewed up in the meat grinder of this war. And that was when I realized just how much of a human tragedy it would be for Ukraine. It wasn't just, civilians who were dying and homes who were being destroyed, but that generation of young leadership that is so important for a country's future was just being annihilated on the battlefields of the East.
There's a paragraph from chapter 5 of your book that I'd like to read for the benefit of our audience, because it kind of ties into what you were saying about the national sacrifice that it means for Ukraine. On 13th March, the anniversary of the joyous day in 1944, when the city was liberated from the Nazis by the Red Army, more than 5,000 people took to the streets, waving the Ukrainian flag and calling for the Russian forces to leave. They shouted, "Kherson is Ukraine, go home." They ignored warning shots fired by Russian troops, attempting to get the protesters to disperse. Now my question to you is, what does it mean for civilians to risk their lives by protesting under occupation? And how does this kind of defiance challenge the narrative of liberation that is claimed by the occupying forces?
It's an excellent and very important question, because one of the things that the Russians had always said about these parts of Ukraine. So just to paint you a picture of where we are, we're in southern Ukraine. We're in a city called Kherson. It's got about 200,000 people. It's very, very southern. It's a port city. It's right next to the mouth of the Dnipro River. And what happens in this city is that it's taken over very, very early without very much fighting at the very, very start of the war. It's the first Russian big prize that they capture. Now, what happens is that the Russians had always said, these people speak Russian, they really should be our subjects, whatever language they speak, whatever culture they have, it's Russian. What we're doing is we're actually coming here to liberate these people. And what these people were saying was twofold. They were saying, one, this isn't true. We're proud Ukrainians. Just because we speak Russian, just because we might have family in Russia, just because we both came from the Soviet Union, doesn't mean we want to be part of a new Russian empire. It doesn't mean we want to live under Putin's dictatorship. We want the chance to chart our own future. And so it really was at the start, when those civilians were going out in their thousands, knowing that they could be shot very easily, that what happened is the message they were sending to the world was, this is our country, we're willing to fight for it, both on the battlefield and in the streets of our cities. I think it's worth going on a little further after that to say that after about 8 months, the city was eventually liberated by the Ukrainian armed forces in one of the most powerful counteroffensives of the war. However, since then, because the Russians are on the other side of the river and are only about 2 or 3 kilometers away, that city is in a very, very sad state right now. And it's being constantly droned and bombed basically every day. Hundreds and hundreds of civilians have been killed there. It's a really tragic situation. And at one point I write, there's billboards all over the city that say things like, Kherson is Ukraine. And I'm like, it's such a terrible price that this city has had to pay for its freedom, with unfortunately no respite or end to that part of the war in sight.
You also, in your book, write extensively about this kind of surreal normalcy that, because normal life after a while must go on, right? For months and months, a city that's being bombarded, people don't know if they're going to be alive the next day. And I particularly like this one paragraph from chapter 6. And it says, Kyiv has become the place where the bounds between war and peace dissolve, where the sounds of artillery and electric guitars, shell fire and bird song mix together in an orchestra that plays the music of heaven and hell together in one great symphony. This is from chapter 7, and in chapter 6 you also write, in fact, every aspect of war itself became normalized the longer you stayed. And you also describe this one incident that really stuck with me, where you're showing a soldier a video of rockets flying above, and you're showing that video very excitedly to him, and he says, you know, unimpressed, good stuff, but we see this every single day. So I want to ask you, how do ordinary people, how did you see them maintain a sense of sanity, of creativity in a city where life and death were existing so close, side by side, with each passing day and each passing month?
Again, a great question, and I think the thing that you have to realize is one of the things I learned in Ukraine was about how the human spirit and the human constitution can survive a lot more than you think it might be able to. The first time, and again, if you were here for the 5-day war, you probably remember how terrifying it was on the first day. After day 4 or 5, you were probably starting to get used to it. You were probably, just a little bit, starting to go back to a normal routine, figuring out how you would start to live your life if there was going to be a long, full-scale war. And the first time you hear a missile or a drone or an explosion near you, you freak out. The 10th time, it's a bit easier. The 50th, 100th time, it just starts to become background noise, effectively. And one of the things that sort of shocked me, and the passage that you quoted is one of my favorites of my own passage, is from Kharkiv, actually. Kharkiv is Ukraine's second biggest city. It's very close to the border with Russia, and it's been besieged a number of times. And during that siege, it was shelled and bombed very, very badly. But because it's such a big city, it still has hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people living there. So what you'll go through is you'll go through the streets, and the streets will be completely empty on a Friday night, and then you'll turn a corner and there'll be a nightclub there. And that nightclub is absolutely packed with people. And I remember going over to it and being like, hey guys, like, what do you think about the war going on? They're like, we're just so used to it now. Like, maybe if a bomb exploded in the street next to us, we'd like go and take photos for a few minutes, but then we kind of just get back to partying. And that kind of blew me away, because I was like, wow, it's just amazing how quickly the human mind and the human body adapts to these kind of situations. There's also obviously a flip side to it, and one of the things that I noticed also was that I would speak to a lot of soldiers who had left the war. Maybe they'd been injured, maybe they'd gotten a job that took them, you know, to the military high command and were back in the capital, and almost always these soldiers said they wanted to go back to the war. They said they didn't feel comfortable in living in civilian life. They felt survivor's guilt because they felt that they'd abandoned their friends and colleagues on the front line. So it's kind of a tribute to the strength of the human spirit, but there's also a very, very dark side to it, because a lot of these people really find a lot of trouble integrating back into human life. And I even remember when I left Ukraine, I did a stint there for about 5 months between January and June 2022. And I remember when I left, it was utterly bizarre. Like, you know, having been from scenes that were like World War II, going to Romania, where, you know, there's kind of nightclubs and partying and, like, you know, good-looking young people out on the streets all hours of the day. It was my mind. It took me a while for me to be able to kind of process that these realities were living so effectively side by side. And it's the thing is, you see this in other conflicts as well. This is not just a Ukraine thing. You know, one of the things that people who work in Lebanon always note is that even when Beirut is being bombed, you'll still have nightclubs going on. Even when, you know, there's a gunfight in one part of the city, people will be going to work and sort of hanging out or having a, you know, coffee or work or business meetings or whatever in another part of the city. So I think in this way it brings home how war can be a very sort of universal human experience. And the last thing I want to touch on is that often you don't know how well you will cope with it until you see it. I've seen the kind of toughest, most kind of muscular, like badass looking guys just freak out the first time they even hear a gunshot in the distance. And one of the stories I hope I'll be able to get into later is that when I was just before the war started in Kiev, I met a young woman in a cafe, and I remember very, very well what she was wearing. She had this kind of red dress, red lipstick, dyed black hair, and kind of blood red nails. I got a DM from her on Instagram about a year later where she was like, Tom, apparently you're signed to come out and work with our unit. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I hadn't heard from her in so long, I had no idea what was going on. Turns out she was now one of the military's top press officers, and she was inviting me out. Now, this girl's about 5 foot, right? Like, much shorter than me, tiny, looks like a twig. And then she's the one who is driving me literally to the front lines. And I remember when she got out of the car, well, the car, it's this massive, big armored personnel carrier, and she had the helmet on, and she had like a AK-47 with her, or whatever the gun was, body armor, extra magazines strapped to her waist. However, the one thing she still had is she still had those blood red nails. Somehow she'd managed to keep her nails perfectly manicured despite living in a frontline trench. And that was kind of one of those incidents of the kind of how war and peace sort of coexist side by side that really blew me away. And that was actually the moment that I was like, oh, there's a really, really good story here. And that's why she became one of the central characters of my book.
My follow-up question from that is a bit more on the personal side. What personal cost of being present for so many months during the war in Ukraine did you have to pay? Were there any moments where you felt seriously in danger? And what did this coexistence between, wartime and normal life look like for you? How are you alternating between these modes? And from that, as well, after the war, because I remember I met you in the UK briefly during this period when you were there. And I know that I could see that it had taken a mental toll on you just being there. So if you could share with our audience a bit more about that, because there's a huge cost, a personal cost. I mean, we take it for granted that we have news coming on our phones, on our Twitter, from all these conflict-ridden regions in the world. But what we don't often realize is the cost that the people who are there to bring this information or news to us have to pay.
So thank you for asking. It's an interesting topic. However, there are some ways in which I dislike, not the question, but this focus in general that a lot of, not from you, but it has now become popular for a lot of conflict reporters to kind of make the story all about themselves and their personal trauma and everything they've had to go through to get these stories. And I find there's a very, very neat overlap between the journalists who do that and the journalists who don't produce that much good reporting and write a story that's basically, rather than writing a story about like the war in Ukraine, they'd write a story like the adventures of Tom Mutch in the war in Ukraine. Basically making it all about themselves. So I will say that I want to preface any answer I give by saying journalists, especially foreign correspondents, have a choice to be there or not. I don't want anyone to feel sorry or any major sympathy for me for having seen, dead bodies or explosions or stuff, because that was a choice I made with the informed consent of knowing exactly what I was getting into. And there are so many people in conflicts around the world who do not have that choice. I think of my colleagues that I work with in Ukraine who are still there. You know, I'm there on the front line for maybe 2 weeks at a time. And it's not even like the front, it's like in the conflict-affected regions. They live there, and they're there the whole time. And when I talk about something like that, I always think it's very important to shout out to the journalists in Gaza who tells a story that is of the most kind of vital public interest and public importance. And what, you know, my worst day in 3 years in Ukraine is there every single day for the last 2 years. They've done things that no foreign reporter has come close to under conditions that are unimaginable for us. So I just want to preface all of that. I also have another kind of an odd, slightly controversial take on this, which is that I think the vast majority of people, journalists, aid workers, diplomats, whoever, who wind up in conflict zones, normally they're messed up by their ordinary lives before they came to a conflict zone, and I often find they're kind of trying to run away from. I've known plenty of people who were running away from debt, from addiction. Some cases they were running away from the law, right? You know, there were definitely people who were wanted by the law in their home countries, and so a lot of these people, I think, are either trying to get away from something, or they're in some way addicted to the kind of trauma. So that's why you'll often see there were a lot of people from the, you know, war on terror or whatever, that Americans or British soldiers who came to Ukraine because they genuinely missed what they'd experienced. In terms of the personal toll on me, I had it, I think, better than a reasonable number of my colleagues. But one of the things that I personally struggled with kind of reintegration into normal life is that when you're in an extremely stressful situation like that, your baseline for experiences gets much, much, much higher. And so when you go back into civilian life, it's very, very hard to feel the same sort of passion, to feel the same sort of happiness, to feel the same sort of sadness, to feel the same sort of emotional range and register that you feel in somewhere like Ukraine. And so for me also, I think, because reporting on, you know, the conflict in Ukraine or the conflict in the West Bank, which I also covered, these things felt like they had an awful lot of, you know, personal meaning, not just personal meaning, but they almost have some kind of spiritual significance to them. It feels like you're making this very genuine sort of contribution to the history of the world or whatever. And then when you go back to an office job, or when you go back to, in my case, I'm currently at university, or when I'm writing up a university assignment, it's just very, very hard to care as much about it. And this is a phenomenon that's very, very common among soldiers and among conflict reporters and among anyone who's come back from war. And it's probably the thing that I've personally struggled with the most. Like, I don't wake up at night, you know, remembering the bodies that I saw in Izium or whatever, as nasty as they were. But for me, it's been that kind of general sense of numbness and inability to fit in with everyday life back in non-war affected civilization that I think has been the thing that has kept me up at night, so to speak, about my own sort of personal, physical and mental health.
Thank you for sharing that. Since you mentioned Gaza and the fact that you reported from the West Bank yourself as well, I want to kind of zoom out of Ukraine. And for a second, I want to ask you what your take on the world right now is, and are there any overarching themes that you're able to draw from conflicts around the world? I mean, Ukraine, what's happening in Palestine. How do you view where we're at this point in history, and what is the significance of this moment that we're all in right now?
Sure. So yes, I did cover the conflict in Palestine, which at first I feel doesn't look that much like the conflict in Ukraine. The more you examine them, the more the similarities jump out. They, I think, are both an imperial and colonial power attempting to either eradicate or subjugate the native people, attempt to suppress their culture. I think one of the very, very interesting things is, for instance, in large parts of the occupied Palestinian territories, the Palestinian flag is banned, just like the Ukrainian flag is banned in the occupied regions of Ukraine that Russia controls at the moment. The attempt to suppress literature, the attempt to suppress, all forms of arts and culture. I think obviously one of the main differences is that and this is why the conflict in Palestine in some ways was harder to cover, is because that oppression is being largely supported by Western governments. I think in the side of Ukraine is being supported by Western governments, I think is absolutely the right thing. Israel is being supported also by most Western governments, which, I think my thoughts on that are pretty obvious. And one of the bad lessons, I think, from the war in Ukraine is that, at least for a while, I think the thought of large-scale military conflict between major world powers was, at least in the West, considered passé. It was kind of considered the one happened in kind of poor, faraway places like Syria or Afghanistan, and maybe the people there were like backward and savage, and that's why they have all these wars all of a sudden. And then I think with the conflict in Ukraine, we realized no, war is a universal human experience. But I also think the Russian invasion has in some way shattered the taboo of large-scale military conflict. People saw that Russia invaded, took large chunks of territory, and mostly got away with it. They mostly, the sanctions didn't do very much to harm their economy. People in Moscow and St. Petersburg still live very kind of nice middle-class lives. And my worry is that that means that people in power in different countries have, and in the same way that Israel has not faced a lot of it hasn't faced real consequences for the atrocities in Gaza. I think people are just realizing that you can use military force and get away with it. And I worry that means we will see in the coming years more large-scale conflicts. It could be India and Pakistan. It could be China and Taiwan. It could be, countries that we never thought would go to war. I don't know, Australia and New Zealand, that sounds like a joke. I'm from New Zealand, but 20, 30 years ago, no one would have really imagined that Russia and Ukraine would have gone to war either. So I worry that we are in a more dangerous, uncertain and difficult era, and the only thing I can kind of say for sure is that these kind of things will likely affect a large number of people, and it won't discriminate by race or religion or geographical region or anything like that, and we're going to have to get used to living in one of those worlds.
Thank you for that terrifying thought. I want to ask you and sort of to firstly share with the audience the exact background between your getting banned from Russia, and B, more generally, what in your experience, I mean, we obviously know that the freedom of the press and of journalists is being stifled. People who want to tell the truth have to face a lot of opposition and have had to struggle a lot in order to bring that truth to the world. So firstly, your own experience in this, and secondly, generally, with other journalists also, how have you seen this attempt to kind of stifle journalism up, close and personal?
Okay, so so basically for a number of reports that I wrote about human rights abuses in formerly occupied territories in Ukraine, territories that have been liberated by the Ukrainian armed forces, I was put on a banned list from entering the Russian Federation. I was told, I'm officially sanctioned. If I ever go to Russia or one of its kind of client states, I will be arrested. I did still go to Russia, however. 6 weeks later, I went in to Russia's Kursk region embedded with the Ukrainian armed forces. So it was kind of quite nice to give a middle finger to the Kremlin like that. And I have to say, Ukraine... This is another one of the times that I will draw something of a distinction between foreign correspondents and local reporters. If you are a journalist, Ukraine is pretty good when it comes to these things, I have to say. You know, we as foreigners get basically pretty free rein to report anything, almost anything that we want, really. And the Ukrainians are normally pretty open, pretty honest, pretty upfront about what they're doing and what we can expect and what the rules are and stuff like that. That said, if you're a journalist, say, working in, I don't know, Belarus or Syria under the Assad regime or something like that, and you're a foreign correspondent, normally the worst thing that will happen to you is you'll be kicked out of the country. Maybe they'll, like, beat you up a little bit. Maybe they'll throw you in jail. It normally doesn't last more than a month or two. There are some horrible exceptions to that, of course. And so I don't in a weird way, it's one of those things that even though I'm technically targeted by an authoritarian regime, it's more a badge of honor than anything else and doesn't have a huge impact on my day-to-day life. Obviously, as I said before, the worst example of an assault on press freedom in the world is the 200 plus journalists that have been killed in Gaza, and I often feel quite sad that more of my colleagues in the West don't kind of make a hue and cry about this, because I think to myself when I see a journalist blown up often in a targeted strike in Gaza, I don't just think, oh, that poor person and their family. I think, oh, if I ever get blown up by a Russian, drone or whatever, they're just going to say, well, these are the new rules of the game. I think it makes it more dangerous for journalists to do our job anywhere in the world, not just in Ukraine.
What sort of was the motivation when you decided to enter Russia with the Ukrainian army, knowing that there was a sanction and that you might be arrested the moment that you're found? And what was that kind of process of crossing over? Were you scared? Was there a particular reason for taking that risk? I mean, was it calculated in terms of you were going there to report on a particular thing, or you were hoping to find or gain access to something? What was the mental process, basically, of balancing out the...
Sure. Look, the motivations were twofold. One, purely ego-based, I'm going to be honest. I wanted to give a middle finger to the Kremlin. I wanted to, be one of the only people who was on a ban list and then flout that ban list 6 weeks later. I went with the Ukrainian armed forces, who controlled quite a large amount of territory, and I knew we wouldn't be going close enough for the Russians for them to recapture the territory unless I was extraordinarily unlucky. The second point, though, was that I wanted to go there and I wanted a chance to talk to the Russian people themselves, because there were still, a few hundred Russian civilians remaining in that area. And I wanted to get a chance to talk to them and be like, what do you think about what's going on? You've seen your neighbors be bombed. Not just your neighbors, but often your friends and family be bombed for 3 years straight. How does this make you feel? What do you think should have been done in Russia to stop this? Do you really believe all of the things you're being told about Nazism or whatever? And what ended up happening was that they basically, and I think this is a lesson we can all take when we think about conflicts closer to home, is they basically denied any complicity. They were like, oh no, it's nothing to do with us. We have no power. The people have no power. The government has all the power. The media has all the power. And whenever I kind of hear or think about someone not speaking up for the truth, whichever kind of conflict you're in, whether it's authoritarian regimes where you live, whether it's Palestine, whether it's Sudan or whatever, I think of these poor people, of these kind of people in Russia, and I see what state their own country got into and how the kind of propaganda warped their brains. And I'm like, well, if you don't take a stand early on in that stance, this is where you end up. I notice we don't have a huge amount of time left. I would quite like to take some questions you want.
Should we open up for
Yeah.
questions? We'll take questions from the audience now. So please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question.
I'm very open and happy to take questions about absolutely anything, Ukraine, any other conflicts. I'm an open book.
Yes. Yes.
Yep.
Even though the made thank you for the information. So I am from Pakistan. I am also a freelance journalist as well. So regarding my question that after the May 2025 conflict, India did a backover. Now recently gave a threat as well. So what is your stance about that? What will be happen in next few days or next few weeks in Pakistan-India conflict?
Okay, look, I'm going to be blunt and say this is not a conflict that I know a huge amount about, right? You know, there's Ukraine, I'm an expert. This, I am very, very, very far away from any kind of expert, so I don't want to make any firm predictions. What I will do is I'll bring it back to what I was saying before, and that people have to realize and have to prepare their lives as if large-scale war is a genuine possibility. Because I met plenty of people in Ukraine before the war who said that it'll never happen. The Russians are our friends or our brothers. Yes, they were saying that before the war. You know, it's the 21st century. Things like this can't happen. And I also think it's worth looking at the similarities, the sort of kind of, because whenever a leader like Modi in India, for instance, wants to consolidate political power at home, one of the tools they can use to do that is war. And I don't want to say that that's definitely what's going to happen, but you have to realize it's a tool in every would-be autocrat's arsenal. It's in their, you know, they have it in their back pocket to use if they feel that they need to, or if they're having domestic political problems at home and want to distract people. Tyrants have done that every year that there's ever been any kind of, no, not just tyrants, democratic leaders, all leaders in all countries have done that. And you have to be prepared for that possibility is all I'm going to say.
Do we have any more questions? Is the mics coming?
Hi. So in your earlier part, you talked about comparing the conflict in Israel and Gaza and Ukraine. And one of the main differences that you mentioned was that Western powers are supporting Ukraine and Western powers are supporting Israel, who's the aggressor. So why do you feel like that difference and that impunity that Israel has, why does that exist? Like, why has it been 2 years without, anyone really making any serious effort to stop the conflict? The same way, if you look at India and Pakistan, when we were on the brink of a full-scale war, people did, make an effort to try and stop it. So why does that not happen in some conflicts, and why does it happen in others?
It's a tough question. It's a valuable question. It's a tough one because the only thing I can genuinely say is that I feel it's not that powers in the West are necessarily good or that they're evil, it's that they're amoral and that they tend to support whoever they think is against their enemies, right? And they might be enemies for the right reasons or they might be enemies for the completely wrong reasons. And I have to say, I do think part of the reason that Western powers have supported Israel, I do think it's cultural bias and discrimination. I think people look at, people in Tel Aviv or, Jewish Israelis and think, oh, they're the same civilization, Judeo-Christian civilization. We have the religion in common. They speak our language. They're all... Israel has a lot of very kind of talented, eloquent speakers who defend their position well, and then they look at sort of, people in Palestine and be like, oh, you know, these are just kind of backwards savages. Why can't they just accept the cards they're dealt in life? And it's one of those things that it's only really when you start going to the Palestinian territories and talking to the people there, which, to be frank, most people in the West don't have the time or the money or the inclination to ever do. It's only when you do that kind of for yourself that you really realize that I think the true origins of what was happening here and the kind of the truth that this is an oppressive colonial regime, you know, subjugating and exploiting these people.
Yes.
Thank you very much. In case of nuclear countries conflict, what is the escalation ladder like extent of damage when one country decides to use nuclear?
It's a good question, because the nuclear escalation ladder has been something that has been very, very well discussed in relation to Russia and Ukraine. And I think one of the things that I have sort of criticized in my book, people in the West, is they kept on worrying about the idea that, like, if you give Ukraine a particular kind of weapons system or a particular type of intelligence, straight away people go for nuclear weapons. And that's not really true. In a conventional conflict, there's rungs on a ladder, right, as you rightly point out. There's what goes on in peacetime, you know, sabotage, spying, all of those kind of things that happen kind of under the sort of military bandwidth. Then there's conventional conflict with conventional armies, right, which almost happened in May this year. Then above that, there's sort of full-scale industrial warfare, which is what you saw in the Second World War, where everyone puts their entire kind of military strategy and economy behind it. So, like, one of the things is the Russians never really did that in Ukraine, right? And I was saying, you know, people just assume that, like, if Russia's losing, they're going to use nuclear weapons. Well, that's the highest thing on the escalation ladder. And there's still rungs below that. And one of the rungs below that is, for instance, declaring full-scale war and then mobilizing all the young men off the streets and turning all your factories into weapons production factories. And that is a rung on the escalation ladder that is before nuclear weapons. So I think, at least in my understanding of conflict, and I could be completely wrong, again, we've only seen nuclear weapons used once in the history of the world in an actual conflict, and that was after many, many years of sort of full-scale industrial war. I think it would be a lot more likely that you'd see a long conventional conflict before the idea of nuclear weapons would ever really seriously be considered.
I'm told that I must wrap up because there's a lunch break. Thank you so much, Tom, for this, for taking the time, for doing a weekend trip from the US to attend this conference. More power to you. May your determination to report the truth remain as unwavering as it is, and may your empathy and compassion always stay the same. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us for this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for coming and for that lovely closing note, Mehrunissa. This present is for you.
Please order your copies of The Dogs of Mariupol. Do you have some with you here? Or?
I have literally one copy, and I'm afraid that's hers. So Amazon is about the only place you're going to get it. Do you want to hold it up in case anyone wants to take photos or remember it or anything like that? Yeah, that is, as far as I know, the first, his full history of the full-scale invasion that has been released to date. Basically, every other one ends at the end of the first year, ends at the end of 2022. This brings the conflict up to the present day, and I think that's really important because the war has changed a lot since 2022 when it was on the front page of every newspaper and every news channel. But yeah, thank you again for coming and for your interest in the book and for your interest in Ukraine.